All right. I am excited to be here with Benjamin Norton of Multipolarista. I believe, Ben, you're joining us from Nicaragua, right?
Yeah, I am. Thanks for
Right
having me,
on.
Justin. Long time listener, first time guest, right?
Yeah, that's right. I'm a huge fan of yours as well, Ben. So people probably know Ben Norton, of course. But Ben is like Ben. You've got a new initiative and a new site, which is I thought a good time to try to nab you. So you've started this initiative called Multipolarista. So I know you made like a 6 or 7 minute intro to what Multipolarista is. I guess there's a channel, a YouTube channel, probably various live channels. Your Twitter feed is immense, but also you're putting it out all there. And then you have a website, right? Multipolarista.com.
Com. Yeah,
Yeah.
.com.
So tell us what that is and like why it's called that and everything.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me. I love your show, and it's always great to reach out or to do another show with someone whose show I've never been on before. So it's great to be here. I'll say that I created this platform, and anyone who's listening is always welcome to contribute. I've already published a few contributors in the first few weeks and trying to grow the website. It's an anti-imperialist news website, and I'm always unapologetic about that. It's anti-imperialist, it's left-wing, and there's a variety of perspectives. The people whose articles I published so far, they probably largely agree with me on many things about capitalism and imperialism and such, but maybe we have some different views. But the name Multipolarista is multipolarist in Spanish. Now, I named it that for a few reasons. One, I was thinking of calling it multipolarist, but I wanted to find something that would work in English and Spanish, because another thing is that I live in Latin America, and actually more and more, a lot of my journalism is in Spanish. I do more interviews in Spanish than in English, because there are so few white US Americans who speak Spanish who are anti-imperialist that they're always like,
it's a novelty.
And I love to do it. Like that Telesur has me on like multiple times a week, and and other outlets. So I love to. I mean, I'm very happy to play that role. Like I think one of my political missions is to try to build more of an alliance between the North American anti-imperialist left and the anti-imperialist left in Latin America. The difference being in Latin America is the anti-imperialist left in multiple countries has state power.
Yeah.
So I wanted to do something that was bilingual, and the website, it's still a lot of English coverage, but I translate not half, not all, but I probably translate around half of the articles, and I have a lot of stuff in Spanish too. And I'm going to be doing some interviews in Spanish. I have an interview lined up with this Argentine diplomat, Alicia Castro, who is the Argentine ambassador to Venezuela. And I got her to talk about Argentina's growing alliance with China and Russia and the IMF debt and all of this. So one of the reasons it's called that, it's specifically not multipolarist in English, which is what I was originally thinking, is because it's a bilingual website. And then why is it called multipolarist or multipolarista? Well, one, because that name wasn't taken, and I had different ideas for an outlet. And it can be hard in the days of the internet where there's so many names of so many different things, and it's like trying to find a band name, and you find a cool name with your friends, and then there's like 30 bands that already have that name in like Wisconsin and Utah. And so anyway, so it was a new name that hadn't been used. But also, I mean, more importantly, I have been thinking of things related to the idea of multipolarity, of a multipolar world. And I thought that I think this is an interesting historical moment, a political moment that we're living in, where I truly think that there is a political shift that we're living through. And, as you said earlier, I mean, I agree with you, Justin, that for many years now, there's been this narrative repeated that finally this is the multipolar moment. This is the multipolar moment. But I actually think that, there's not one specific moment, but I think that in the past several years, especially since the election of Donald Trump, we have seen a massive decline in the power of US hegemony and a massive crisis within the US-led unipolar hegemonic order that was constructed I mean, not just in the 1990s, it was constructed before that throughout the first Cold War, but that was the moment of primacy, of global primacy of the US empire. You had George H.W. Bush. It's no coincidence that he was a not so secret former CIA agent who became CIA director. So this is someone who was, people call him the master of the deep state. This is someone who helped oversee capitalism's invisible army, the CIA, which used all of these dirty tricks and tactics to wage hybrid war around the world to maintain imperialism and capitalism. And then you have this former CIA director becomes president. And then when the Soviet Union is overthrown, the socialist bloc is overthrown, anti-colonialist movements face counter-revolution around the world. So you see that in Nicaragua with the Sandinistas losing power. You see neoliberals come to power in many different countries. You see that some of these movements that had a history of being on the left, like the Indian National Congress, like the Congress in South Africa as well. They take a neoliberal turn. They're forced to compromise with imperialism to survive. So this is a moment where it's a moment of counter-revolution, and you have the U.S. government declare, specifically with the first invasion of Iraq, you see George H.W. Bush declares a new world order, and that is unipolar U.S. hegemony, right? And there's been a lot of people predicting that the end of U.S. hegemony is here, the end of U.S. hegemony is here. But I really actually think that there are a few things that happened in the past several years, which we can talk about. The election of Donald Trump, the growing alliance between China and Russia, and also Iran, which is extremely fundamental in this because, of course, China and Russia have historically not necessarily had positive relations, especially in modern history, going back to the Sino-Soviet split. China and Russia now are closer than they even were probably since in the 1950s, because in the 1950s, Mao took a trip to the Soviet Union right after the revolution. They signed a brothership agreement, and that was Mao's actually first and only trip he ever took outside of China. So that was important. But the reality is that even then, they didn't necessarily have a military partnership, and they did have a lot of collaboration, but it's not at the same degree now. So if that relationship continues, and I think there's a lot of reason to continue to believe that it will, I think that that's a fundamental, dramatic political and economic shift in the world. I think we're also seeing that there's a fundamental crisis in NATO, and that was shown by the election of Trump, and especially now with this manufactured crisis over Ukraine.
I was going to say that NATO will get along as soon as Russia actually invades Ukraine, which I hear is happening any day now, right?
Yeah, and I mean, in fact, Justin, I think I think in 32 minutes from now, according to the CIA, they're going to invade, and they know exactly where it's going to be. And but this is exactly why there's this crisis in Ukraine. It's because it's about enforcing NATO bloc discipline, because the US recognizes the decline of its power and its control over Europe. And the whole point of NATO, as NATO strategists have said, going back to when it was created in 1949, they said the whole point is keeping the Soviet Union out, Germany down, and the US on top. That's been the slogan. And then it changed after the overthrow of the Soviet Union: keep Russia out, Germany down, and the US on top. But specifically, the key point is Germany down, keeping Europe subordinated to the United States, because this transatlantic alliance that was constructed, there's nothing natural about that. It's absurd. Like, why would these countries, especially Germany, rely so heavily on trade with a country on the other side of the planet, the United States, right, when they could do trade with not just Russia, but also China? So the conflict in Ukraine, by the way, is not just about Russia. It's also about China, because more and more these two countries, and also Iran and the Eurasian Bloc, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, they're allies, especially economic allies. So anyway, the point is, I mean, I want to hear your thoughts about this. Maybe you disagree, but I think that at the very least, even if US unipolarity is not truly dead, even if, it still somehow lives on as this kind of zombie empire.
Yeah.
I mean, the US empire is not, obviously, just because unipolarity is done doesn't mean that the US empire is done. I mean, yeah, it's still obviously rampaging around the world, committing many crimes. And let's not forget that empires in decline often commit their worst crimes. So yeah, the Ottoman genocide, the if you look at the horrible atrocities during the civil war of the White Army that was basically trying to commit genocide during the Civil War, the British Empire committing mass starvation and genocide basically in the South Asian continent and also across Africa. Like, the point is that, I mean, the US is in decline clearly, but that doesn't mean that it's not, that its worse isn't yet to come. But I actually do think that we're living in this interesting moment. And at the very least, as a journalist, this is the stuff I focused on anyway. So I thought it would be a good way to kind of focus the theme and report on these, I think, these historic changes we're seeing.
The reason I don't disagree with you, by the way. I'm actually really you want to get my perspective, but I want to get your perspective. The reason I wanted to ask the specific question that I wanted to ask you, assuming you can hear me.
Yeah, sorry, I was fixing something with my camera.
That's okay.
The light on my camera is weird today. The question you wanted to ask.
Yeah. So because, like, I think the last time people were really talking about multipolarity was like this whole BRICS, right? So Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. And I remember like how the Brazil part was taken out by the coup against Dilma and like the jailing of Lula, and then the I was taken out by Modi, who's like fully joined the Western bloc, and like
and we'll never form an alliance with China in a million years.
No, exactly.
It's too politically useful to just demonize China for everything, and like that's all BJP does. I mean,
so
it's
Muslims in China, like the Indian civilization was completely destroyed by the British, and is like being ongoing like pressure from the West, and so obviously the logical thing to do is focus on Muslims in China.
Well, and then the fact that China and Pakistan are such close allies, I mean, it's not going to happen. Like,
So okay. So they took out the B and the I, and South Africa, I mean, I think, I think they're probably the best prospect of getting closer to the RC than the B and the I. But like, if they can take those out, can they take out, like, I don't see a regime change happening in Russia or China having any success, but presumably that's their goal. But what do you think about like why those are more resilient to these kinds of regime change efforts then?
Yeah, well, I'll say first of all that the Atlantic Council, which is NATO's de facto think tank, they published this thing called the Longer Telegram, which is a direct reference to the Long Telegram of Kennan, the Cold War architect of containment policy toward the Soviet Union, which, by the way, he later regretted. But
he didn't regret as like we should have fought a war? Because I mean, the containment policy, I think, is often not understood as like he was saying we should try to contain them rather than nuclear war. I think he was like the left. he was the peace loving pole of the debate, believe it or not. So he was trying to say, let's not like focus on nuking Russian cities. Let's just contain them. Exactly.
Well, we should understand that containment was only the U.S. policy for a few years. After that, it was rollback. This is actually not really taught in schools in the U.S. in history classes. They talk about containment because it sounds much nicer. Contain the so-called communist threat.
Coming. Yeah.
But after that, no. I mean, they have NSC 66 or 68, I think, there's this national security memo in which they say, no, the new policy is rollback. We need to be much more aggressive. But anyway, the point is that the Atlantic Council published this Longer Telegram, which is a direct reference to the Long Telegram of Kennan. And the Longer Telegram is anonymous, but it's clearly some kind of senior U.S. government official, prominent figure, and it calls pretty explicitly for overthrowing Xi Jinping by encouraging divisions within the Central Committee of the Communist Party of China. It also, and then explicitly it states that China should recognize that it's in its best interests to be part of the US-led liberal international order instead of creating its own alternative order. That's the way they say it, which is them explicitly saying that China should continue subordinating itself and its economy and its political interests to US imperialism instead of building another pole, which is, I mean, that's what anti-imperialists have been saying, that like this is clearly the strategy toward China, and then they just came out and said it openly. So I mean,
That's a
that is their
hard. That's a hard one. That's a hard one to pull off. Harder than Brazil for sure,
much
right?
harder.
Yeah.
Well, the thing about Brazil is that the Brazilian state is weak and the Brazilian state is very divided. The Chinese state is very strong. It's the strongest thing in China. And that's because the Communist Party of China understood when they took power in 49 that in a weak country, or excuse me, in a country with a weak state, that is, that you have to have a strong state to develop the country. And, you know, there's a lot of debates about Deng Xiaoping. I'm actually not one of the people who like sings the praise of Deng Xiaoping. I think he's a complex historical figure, but I also don't think he's like this evil traitor that he's made out to be by some like orthodox Maoist. Like, I'm not a Maoist, but I also don't, I think he's a complex historical figure, and especially his foreign policy was atrocious, the alliances that he made with imperialism. But I mean, if you would look at what China, the path that it's taken, the idea that China was just going to take the capitalist road and just become another, you know, junior partner of U.S. imperialism is objectively false. And it does have this interesting path forward. And I think Xi Jinping actually is a marked shift. His policies represent a shift, certainly back to the left. And, you know, there are people who say that Xi Jinping is following the blueprint laid by Deng Xiaoping. I mean, you could say that about a lot of people, but the reality is that he has emphasized a return toward pretty, I mean, at this point, an anti-imperialist foreign policy, or at least a foreign policy that supports our liberation movements in the global South, a foreign policy that supports non-intervention and sovereignty, a foreign policy that.
Yeah, that's what my sense is. Like, they're very not, they say they're not going to interfere in internal politics, and they actually mean it, which is like a difference. Like, people hardly say it, and then the people who say it don't often mean it, but that does seem to be the case. So like in some cases where we might not be fans of it, like they have big projects with Israel, right? They have big projects with anybody because that's their position. They're just, we don't interfere. And so, you know, it's consistent, it seems to me. So they'll deal with Cuba, they'll deal with Iran, and they'll deal with Israel.
Yeah, I mean, that's been their policy for a few decades, but I actually think, and that's still certainly their policy, but actually we've seen just in the past few years, especially when the Obama administration initiated the Asian pivot, right? Which is pivot to war in Asia, specifically war on China. And this was the Hillary Clinton State Department. You saw hilariously that Hillary Clinton announced an attempt to build a new Silk Road as an alternative to China's new Silk Road, which, I mean, just outlandish. But anyway, but especially when Trump came in, we saw that China began taking a more nationalist foreign policy, and also began, I would say, more openly, not only pursuing a policy of non-intervention, which has been consistent for decades, but actually openly, strongly supporting Venezuela. Now, I mean, here in a few months, China and Nicaragua have become best friends. Like every day in the Nicaraguan media, there's coverage of China and all these things that they're doing. So, I mean, they've taken an activist foreign policy, and I think that's partially because not just Xi, but a lot of elements of the Chinese leadership recognize that there was this kind of vacuum in international leadership with Trump, and they decided they wanted to fill that. And the thing is, Deng Xiaoping pursued this policy where he said, we have to lie low and bide our time, and maintain a low profile and bide time is how it's usually translated. And that was the policy that they did pursue for about 20 years. And now, I mean, pretty explicitly, we see that China has created a new series of international alliances, including at the United Nations. They have a diplomatic alliance called the Group of Friends in Defense of the United Nations Charter, which consists of, basically, it's an anti-imperialist axis. I mean, it's created,
almost everybody on there is being sanctioned.
Yep.
In some way.
So it was actually interestingly created largely with the diplomatic leadership of Venezuela, but China was kind of the original like convener of this group. And it has China, Russia, Palestine, Iran, Syria, Eritrea, Venezuela, Nicaragua, Cuba, Bolivia. I mean, yeah, it really is.
Oh my God, it's a liberal. Liberals hearing this are
Laos,
just getting
Laos, the DPRK,
getting a rash or something.
Yeah, so that's diplomatically.
Country.
China recently created something similar economically, which is a little broader. It does include the Gulf monarchies, but it also shows that multipolarity doesn't necessarily mean, like I said, the end of imperialism at
Right.
all. In fact, what it does is it makes more contradictions where you have, reactionary powers like the Gulf monarchies who are going to try to play different sides against each other. Turkey is a great example of this.
Yeah.
I mean, Turkey is the second largest member of NATO in terms of its military size, and it's still allies with the US closely on things like, for instance, on Ukraine. Yeah. Turkey is selling Ukraine drones, which Ukraine is using to attack the Russian-speaking Ukrainians in the Donbass. But meanwhile, Turkey is trying to improve its relations with Russia, and Turkey bought the S-400 missile defense system from Russia. So that's multipolarity. It's not. That's multipolarity. It doesn't mean that U.S. imperialism is done, but the point is that this idea of this unipolar moment, I think we can pretty clearly say is dead. And whether or not the end is the Iraq War, whether or not the end is the 2008-2009 financial crash, or whether or not the end is the election of Donald Trump, I mean, I think we could debate all those points, but the reality is that it's a fundamentally different world. And we can see that in the foreign policy of countries like Nicaragua or like Venezuela that have socialist governments and say, well, we no longer, or even Argentina, which doesn't have a socialist government, has a social democratic at best government, but they can say, look, we have other options now. And Alberto Fernandez, who is, I didn't even expect this when I launched my website, but like a week after I launched my website, the center-left president of Argentina went on a trip to Russia and China and told Russia that he's tired. He wants Argentina to end its dependence on the United States and the IMF. That is historic.
Well, the IMF, yeah, what they did to everywhere, but Argentina is a pretty dramatic. But okay, so regime change will be hard in China, but they did manage to pull it off in Russia with Yeltsin and even Gorbachev, arguably. So is that, that's the only other way out I can see, is that they may, if Putin gets old or, has an accident or something.
Yeah, well, Putin actually, in the past few years, this hasn't gotten a lot of coverage. He's actually been, and it's not just Putin. The thing is, there's like Putin, this figure as if he's like some godlike omniscient figure. But the Russian state, the Kremlin has been reforming the constitution and been reforming the form of the Russian state and actually slightly decentralizing power, with the understanding that Putin is probably going to retire in the next few years. Mm-hmm. But he will maintain some kind of role, basically kind of helping to oversee foreign policy. And a lot of people suspect that the reason that he'll do that is to make sure that Russia's foreign policy does not shift back to the West. I mean, like, if you think about Putin, he's an interesting case because this is a guy who was a pretty clear anti-communist. I mean, and he was the right-hand man of Yeltsin. And he originally, when he came in, he wanted Russia to integrate with Western imperialism. He wanted it to join NATO, and it was NATO that didn't want Russia to join. Yeah. And this actually, ironically, it pushed even a kind of, a nationalist figure like Putin. The thing about Russian politics is that Putin is actually a centrist in Russian politics. Like, the idea that he's like this far right figure is part of like the liberal imperialist attempt to portray him as like a Trumpian figure. In the context of Russian politics, there is a viciously xenophobic, racist right wing that Putin is not in any way allied with. He's criticized, and like there are forces that run against him in the elections that are actually fascist. And then there's, of course, the Communist Party. And so he's this kind of central pole in between like the hardcore far right nationalists and between the communists. Yeah. And he, he has rebuilt the Russian state with the understanding of the experience of the Yeltsin years and seeing the living standards of Russians just implode, seeing the life expectancy of Russians, especially Russian men, decline by several years, millions of excess deaths, according to the World Health Organization, after the overthrow of the Soviet Union and the privatization of everything and the neoliberal shock therapy. So he's been through the humiliation of those years. And, again, Russia has a capitalist government. I'm certainly not going to pretend like it's a socialist model. The Chinese government is very different, but Russia, if you look at their economic model, it's actually very different from US-led neoliberalism. And this is why I've learned a lot from reading the books of Michael Hudson. And I know
Michael Hudson's so good.
A genius. But one of the points that he constantly makes, which I never thought about, is how neoliberalism is so inextricably tied to US imperialism.
Yeah.
And it represents a particular phase of capitalism led by the US empire. And it's not a coincidence that neoliberalism emerged when the Soviet Union was in decline and crisis. And when it was overthrown, forcing many countries in the global south, these post-colonial movements, to integrate into US imperialism to maintain,
like
maintain state control.
While the Soviet Union existed, there was no European Union, there was no World Trade Organization. Like the number of things that popped up only because the Soviet Union fell. Like the Kosovo War probably wouldn't have happened. The Afghanistan War probably, Afghanistan wouldn't have fallen apart the way that it did if Yeltsin, like that wasn't a war they lost, right? That was Yeltsin just giving it away.
Yeah,
like, that's what most people don't realize that. But like Afghanistan could have held on probably forever if the Soviet Union hadn't just, or if Russia, I guess, hadn't just decided to give the Americans everything they wanted. So
yeah, and this is getting to a point that I wanted to make about the idea of multipolarity, because there's also, I mean, it is true that there are right-wing people who talk about multipolarity, but I think there's a left wing, and this is in Latin America, there's more and more discussion among leftists of multipolarity. And for instance, I've closely followed most of the speeches of President Maduro in Venezuela, of course, Comandante Daniel Ortega, the president of Nicaragua. And more in their speeches in the past few years, they've started talking about multipolarity, and talking about un mundo multipolar. In fact, in his most recent speech at the UN General Assembly, President Maduro of Venezuela openly called for the creation of a multipolar world. So this has become more and more on the Latin American left a discussion, because they've kind of realized also, which is another big part of my mission at Multipolarista, because I focus so much on Latin America, is that there was this discussion of the pink tide in the early 2000s, right? And it was a real force, but it also is misunderstood, because outside of Latin America, there's this idea that there was this unified block of left-wing forces that was called the pink tide. First of all, in Latin America, no one uses the term pink tide. That's a foreign term used in English. Second of all, they will talk about a progressive wave, but they'll talk about it in a way that's more complicated, that understands that there was a main thrust being led by Venezuela and Cuba, and then Nicaragua. And then there were other countries that came on later, Bolivia, Ecuador, and then of course, Brazil. But the situation with Brazil is different, because Lula came in originally. I mean, he was a left-wing, longtime left-wing activist, but this is before the rise of Hugo Chavez, and this is before it was a more radical movement. And Lula was, especially in his first term, he was a much more center-left figure, social democratic figure. But it was actually, the point I'm getting at is that the pink tide always had divisions within it that are very stark. So the difference politically between Hugo Chavez and the former center-left at best president of Chile, who's now working at the United Nations, which, I mean, Michelle Bachelet, like the extent to which you can call her on the left is,
no, I think she's supportive of sanctions in Venezuela, even like very, very halfway against it kind of statement that she made. But
like, she's lumped in, like the idea, the narrative of the pink tide is that all of these countries had left-wing governments. I mean, it's much more the reality is, I would say a better way to see the pink tide is that there were a few revolutionary movements that were able to achieve state power, especially Venezuela, Nicaragua, the Sandinistas came back, Bolivia, and then Ecuador. Those were the main forces of the pink tide, because those were the countries that joined the ALBA. And if you want to talk about the pink tide, the most less important than the term the pink tide is the creation of the ALBA, the Bolivarian Alliance, which was an attempt by Hugo Chavez and Fidel Castro when in the early 2000s, the Bush administration was trying to create a free trade zone of the Americas. They had NAFTA, and a decade after NAFTA, they were trying to create a NAFTA for all of the Americas. And in response to that, Hugo Chavez went to this meeting in Argentina that the US organized for this free trade zone, and he protested it. And famously, the Argentine football player, what's his name? I'm not a football guy, who just died. The hand of God.
I don't know them very well either. Messi or Maradona or
Maradona, Diego
yeah.
Maradona. He came with this. My friends are going to kill me for forgetting his name, but I'm not a big sports guy. But he came with this shirt portraying George Bush as a Nazi. But anyway, they came to this summit, and famously at the summit, Hugo Chavez declared. Cuba didn't go, of course, but Hugo Chavez declared, "We are creating an alternative bloc of only Latin American countries called the Bolivarian Alliance. We are going to challenge U.S. hegemony, U.S. imperialism directly." And what happened is that in Latin America, there's always been this idea of the patria grande, the great motherland.
Jose Martí and Simón Bolívar, of course.
That all of the Americas are part of a bloc that should. I mean, if there's a revolution against settler colonialism in the U.S., I mean, we can see how that could work out. Especially if there's like a revolution in Southern secession that forms a Chicano state or something. Anyway, whatever. But
exactly.
the point
Canada,
is
Turtle Island needs to go back to indigenous nations, of course.
Exactly. So the reality is that vision, I mean, the Latin American left, at least the anti-imperialist left, still very much talks about the patria grande. Like in Argentina, the most left-wing, the best political group in Argentina is the Frente Patria Grande. They're like the anti-imperialists. So, but the thing is, that vision that Chavez had, it unfortunately did not come into fruition. That U.S. imperialism, especially under the Obama administration, was very successful in exploiting internal divisions within the Latin American left.
Yeah, I mean, my thing was the biggest coup the U.S. pulled off, pun intended, was getting Brazil to support the occupation of Haiti and the overthrow of Aristide, because once they did that, it's like Brazil's non-opposition to Cuba and Venezuela and what they were doing was so huge. And once they entered into that trade-off to try to get a non-permanent seat on the UN Security Council, and I mean, the minute they got into that, it was, that was the beginning of the end for the pink tide. I mean,
exactly. And it shows those weaknesses. I mean, Chile is a great example, but also Argentina. I mean, the Kirchners were supportive, but Argentina was another weaker link. And then, of course, you have the election of Lenin Moreno in Ecuador, who turns out to be a total traitor, who betrays Rafael Correa, who, by the way, Rafael Correa is up there with Evo Morales and Ortega and Maduro as one of the figures who actually still believes in this process of regional integration. And that's why that's why there's 30 fake charges against him and he can never return to his country and he's living in exile. But the point I'm getting at is that more and more, this vision of the Patria Grande, it's still a vision in the back of the minds in the long term of the Latin American left. But especially in the past decade, with times of counter-revolution, the US-backed coup in Honduras in 2009, the soft coup in Paraguay in 2012, the soft coup in Brazil in 2016, the imprisonment of Lula in 2018, and then the right-wing takeover of Argentina, the right-wing takeover of Chile, and now, even now, with the election of these very milquetoast liberal figures like Gabriel Boric in Chile, who spent basically all of his election campaign in Chile saying, "Don't worry, I hate China. Don't worry, I hate Cuba. Don't worry, I hate Venezuela and Nicaragua." So the reality is that a lot of the Latin American left has started talking about multipolarity because they're actually not looking necessarily to Chile for support. They're looking to China and Russia and Iran. And we've seen not only political support, but significant economic support. Iran has been a major lifeline for Venezuela. And this is part of multipolarity too. Multipolarity is not just about great powers. Iran, as a regional power, has become a major international player well outside of West Asia. Iran has become in Latin America, not only in Venezuela, even here in Nicaragua. Iran has more and more economic ties. In Venezuela, not only has Iran helped to save Venezuela's oil industry from total destruction because of the illegal US blockade, Iran also opened up a chain of supermarkets in Venezuela selling Iranian goods, Iranian food.
That's amazing. It's pretty good. I mean,
this is multipolarity too. And the reality is that, like I said, there's not all of multipolarity is good. I mean, Turkey's an example of that. Turkey's an example of a country, I think, that even though it's actually not just a puppet of the US and NATO. Turkey has its
own, too complicated to for that.
It
For
has
sure.
its own national interests. It has its own imperial ambitions, and it plays a very reactionary role in many contexts. Especially
Sure
we
does.
see like what it's doing with Ukraine, what it's doing in Syria, what it's doing in the Caucasus, what it's doing with Azerbaijan and Armenia. Like Turkey's it's not a positive example of multipolarity, but it is an example of multipolarity.
Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
think, I think we should start talking about that more and analyzing it.
So we talked about Xi Jinping, we talked about Putin, you mentioned Comandante Ortega, Chavez, Maduro. These are just a list, Ben, of strong men, of authoritarians, of, like this is one of the problems we have, like anti-imperialists have, which is like there's taboo about every regime that's in the gun sights of, I mean, we didn't even talk about Assad yet, right? We did Iran, but how do you approach this? Like when you're talking about this or writing about this, like this is one of the main things, right? Like even from the left, like I don't know, they would probably object to being characterized this way, but like let's call them the not anti-imperialist left, um somewhere between that and anti-imperialist or whatever. But they say, you have to listen to the voices of the people, and it's like you are in Nicaragua, but like there's all these people in Nicaragua, the voices of the people are crying out for, and you're supporting this regime. It's always support for a regime. Same with Venezuela. I've heard that about Venezuela. Obviously, the case can be made. So how do you take that on, and how do you think about that and talk about that in terms of like regimes? And
Well, a few different ways. First of all, I mean, some of the most brutally authoritarian regimes on the planet are very close allies of US imperialism. So, I mean, not only the reactionary Gulf monarchies, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, but also, I mean, look at Brazil. I mean, one of the most viciously reactionary countries on earth right now in terms of the government. India, I mean, probably the most fascistic government on earth, probably even more than the Brazilian government.
yeah,
Like if you had to look at any government right now that is the most explicitly fascistic, it is
literally, politically, programmatically fascist. Yeah.
it is it is the country that is the US's closest ally in South Asia. Like
They
so
invented a whole term. They would have called it East Asia, but now they call it the Indo-Pacific, just
yep.
to throw India in there, where
Yep.
it has no business and no interests being. Yeah. So
Exactly. So I mean there's that obvious hypocrisy. But then there's also the fact that, as you have done a lot of great work showing, this is just straight up Orientalism. This goes back to the Oriental despotism. It's just the 21st century version of that. Every official enemy of US/NATO/EU imperialism, which happened to be the majority white countries, every single enemy that they have on their target list just happens to be led by Oriental despots. Like, so, I mean, there's a huge element of racism, which is the tool used by imperialism to justify, all of its exploits and crimes, which is exactly why white supremacy was created as a concept, why whiteness was created as a concept, to justify conquest of the global South, conquest of the Americas. I mean, there's brilliant books about this, the invention of the white race, how the Irish became white. I mean, very clearly in the United States, it's such a clear example of this as the settler colonial project that helped create whiteness to distinguish the colonialists from not only the indigenous population, but also immigrants who came later. And then, of course, slaves who were forcibly brought from Africa. So I mean, there's a huge element of that. But then also, I think we just have to look at, which is related to the racist element, that if you just look at these countries, especially, I mean, I kind of decided a few years ago, I speak Spanish, I love Latin America, that I would focus a lot more on Latin America. And I left the US about 4 years ago now, and I have no interest in going back. And yeah, I mean, I have permanent residency in Nicaragua. Like I spent like a while in Venezuela. But anyway, the point is that I want to keep doing work here. I think there's a lot of important stuff that doesn't get covered in English. And if it does, it's usually like insane right-wing regime changers. But if you look at the governments that are demonized as so-called authoritarian regimes, they have massive, broad popular support. So even in Venezuela, which is still suffering under a brutal, grueling illegal blockade that has seriously, I mean, it has suffered a major economic crisis. I've been to Venezuela multiple times. I've seen it, but there's still massive support for the government because people are not dumb and they have memories, and especially older people. Now, the younger generation is complicated because, if you were born, in 2004 and all you remember is Hugo Chavez, it's very different. But the reality is that if you remember the years of neoliberalism, despite how awful things are economically, despite the inflation, despite the lack of goods caused by, capitalist hoarding and by the blockade and all these, you still remember how difficult things were in the neoliberal era when you didn't have housing that was given to you by the Chavista government. And nearly 4 million housing units have been created by the Chavista government. You didn't have healthcare and at all, even though there is a shortage of medicines and products like there is in Iran because of the blockade. In Venezuela, I had to go to the hospital, and there are a shortage of some goods in Venezuela. Like, there are difficulties, but despite that, people recognize that their lives are still better than they were before. Exactly the same in Nicaragua. I mean, the Nicaraguan government is massively popular. Over 2/3 of the population, according to polls. Now, it's not 100%, but the point is that in Cuba, the same thing. If you visit these countries, and I've never been to Syria, but I've been to all the evil boogeyman regimes in Latin America, right? There is massive, broad popular support, especially among poor and working people, for their governments. So when you see that and when you understand that, the propaganda just dies. Like, the idea that these are authoritarian, no, it's actually the opposite. Like, I would say that I'll go even further, that not only are the Venezuelan, Nicaraguan, Cuban, and Bolivian governments more popular than the US government and more democratic, I'll go out and say that the Chinese, Russian, and Iranian governments are more popular and democratic than the US government. Look at polling in the US. Everyone hates the US government. Like, polling for Congress is like single digit approval.
Right.
Meanwhile, like, obviously not everyone just loves everything about their government in China, Russia, and Iran, but there actually is pretty significant popular broad-based support. And it shows that just having an election in which you have a figurehead, a face who changes every 4 years, but the policies never change, that doesn't make you a democracy. And just because, yes, you have a one-party state like in China, doesn't mean that you're authoritarian, because the Chinese government is much more responsive to the democratic needs of its people than the US government
is. And you can get rid of officials in China, and you can get rid of officials in Cuba, and you can't get rid of these people in North
Clintons,
America.
They just won't go away.
They can't get rid of. Okay, so let's talk about with, I don't know how much, I don't want to take too much of more of your time, but like two basically more questions. One is about, related to this propaganda about regimes. Another one for you is like, because of this, I want to talk to you about the convoy, that Canada trucker convoy, because we've been on the same side of this, and not all of our friends are, let's just say. But like,
also the difference between that you and many people criticizing that position is you are in Canada.
Yeah, yeah, they've been around. Those people, I've seen them around. But yeah, so there's always this thing that I've noticed. I noticed it especially with starting with Syria, which is how you and I met, I think, was like, people who were pro-Palestine, who were like, yeah, we're pro-Palestine, but obviously Assad must go. And I don't understand how you can be pro-Palestine and not think that the US
and not ally with Israel against Syria.
And not ally with Israel against Syria. That's one. And then the next one is, whatever, China, China's really bad, right? So, but now there's like another split I'm seeing with people that are otherwise like on side with Palestine and Syria and Venezuela and all the issues that I care about. And then they're like, yeah, but vaccine mandates are fascism and the truckers are righteous. So like, the general question of like, why does this keep happening on every issue is one question. Like, what are we doing wrong that we can't seem to convince our own comrades of this is one question. And the other question is sort of like, then we can start getting into the specifics of the truckers or whatever.
Well, Justin, I've been thinking about this a lot, and I think it's very similar. It's basically the same political dispute and debate over this idea of patriotic socialism. Have you followed this?
Yeah.
It's the same people on the same sides, and it's the same debate. And now the same people who are the so-called patriotic socialists are the ones who are doing like a lot of like crypto anti-vax stuff, and who are now fully on board with this convoy, which is not led by truckers, but it's called a trucker convoy. It's led by non-truckers. In fact, 90% of truckers in Canada who cross the US border are vaccinated. All of the truckers' unions, including Teamsters, have come out against it forcefully. And the Canadian Labour Congress, representing all of the major unions in Canada, have come out against it, along with First Nations community leaders. Like every progressive group, the Communist Party of Canada, I mean, if anyone knows like how to be like a revolutionary in Canada, it's the Communist Party, and they're out there against it. And the people who support it are like these so-called patriotic socialists, who are also the ones who like there's this attempt to basically argue, this is their position, that conservatives are easier to win over than liberals to be socialists. And you see like these patriotic socialists are saying that basically that communism is conservatism, they say. They try to cherry pick history, and they say like the Soviet Union in the 1930s, or they look at particular times. Actually, not really the 30s. It was not at all conservative, but
30s.
Not at all. Actually, what they do is they look at, well, specifically when they're talking about like the question of abortion. So especially like they look like the abortion issue. But what they do is that they look at like at certain periods in the history of the Soviet Union, especially because they had to increase the population, you know, abortion was more difficult, although later on it was free and easily available. And so, and, you know, the complex history of LGBT rights in the Soviet Union. The point is that they look at like certain periods in the early era of the Soviet Union, all these, and then basically they say that, well, conservatives are more revolutionary than liberals, and we should try to win over conservatives.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Because a big portion of Russian society was conservative when the revolution happened. And
That's the argument made by some of these so-called patriotic socialist people who are the ones pushing the convoy. And their argument is that working class people are conservative, and that so our movement should.
Some of them are.
Yeah, but it's absurd. It's ridiculous. That's their argument.
Working class people are all kinds of things.
Yeah. I mean, most working class people have no idea what their politics are, which is actually fine, because like a lot of most bourgeois politics is a distraction anyway. So, but the reality is that it's the same people pushing this convoy now, and they insist on portraying it as a working class movement because it justifies their thesis, but it's a bogus thesis. All you have to do, I mean, what kind of working class movement has a GoFundMe that was created by non-truckers, by the way? The GoFundMe campaign was created by two non-truckers, and you probably know who they are. They're these insane, like right-wing Canadian political figures involved in like these like right-wing white nationalist parties.
Yeah. And crypto. One of them is like selling his own custom crypto.
There you go. And they created this GoFundMe campaign, which raised $10 million in 2 weeks. And they had single anonymous donations as high as $215,000. So very working class, getting like rich. And then now we have this leaked data showing that a huge millions of dollars are coming from the United States. And they're coming from conservative communities that are Republican majority districts in the United States, in these rich suburbs. Like, I think actually, when I want to hear your position on this, I actually think what this reflects is this idea, which I think is true, that fascism, there's this narrative that fascism was always the tool of the bourgeoisie at a moment of capitalist crisis to save capitalism from socialism. I think that is mostly correct. That is for the most part correct. However, I think it's more complicated.
Yeah.
Fascism also, there's an element of fascism that I think you could call the counter-revolutionary revolution, a far-right revolution, in the sense that there's always been in fascism an element of anti-systemic rage, but it's ultra-reactionary and basically neo-feudal. And it's basically a neo-feudal response to capitalism. And I think actually the BJP is a great example of this. The BJP is a thoroughly neoliberal party, a capitalist party, but we've even seen some Hindu nationalists, Hindutva supporters, who have tried to appropriate like anti-colonial rhetoric and tried to,
for sure.
And like in the US, you see like Donald Trump and these people like Paul Joseph Watson, this just punchable moron. He has tried to popularize this idea that conservative is the new punk, right?
Oh God.
There's this attempt, or they call like right-wing populism. And I'm not saying that they're necessarily explicit fascist, but it's fascistic in the sense that like you know, it was called the National Socialist Party, right? Like,
right, patriotic socialist or national
yeah,
socialist. Yeah, yeah,
like the
exactly.
reality is that fascism is a particular kind of revolutionary wing of the far right.
Yeah,
Like, it's not revolutionary in the sense of it's revolutionary in a progressive sense, but it's revolutionary in the sense
they
that
want to
they
overthrow the
actually
system.
overthrow the system and replace it with something even more deeply reactionary, because
Yeah,
they're actually against even the liberal elements of capitalism itself.
yeah,
And they want to bring back, because look, I mean, it's true that capitalist globalization, there is a right-wing critique of it, not just a left-wing critique. There's the conservative critique, which we see from BJP, and we see from right-wing nationalists like Donald Trump, that says that, well, with capitalism, it forced women into the labor market, and women should
yeah,
just be, they should be at home.
yeah,
It forced immigrants into our countries. We don't want immigrants.
yeah,
It displaces people. It forces parents to work so much that they can't be at home with their children, and force the patriarchal. It destroys the patriarchal household. Like, there is a conservative right-wing critique of capitalism, and there are like there's an attempt by like some, like the patriotic socialists, basically to form an alliance with like a conservative critique of
right,
capital. And you can see this with like the people who like are trying to defend Tucker Carlson,
yeah,
because this fucking white nationalist who, can I cuss? Sorry.
yeah. Of course, of course.
This guy who, I mean, Tucker Carlson doesn't want a war with Russia because he thinks they're kind of white. He wants a war with China instead. They're
Yeah,
like, look, he's anti-war. It's like, yeah, he's not against war with Russia. He wants war in China. And Matt Gaetz, he gave this speech recently where, after Argentina's president, Matt Gaetz is like this, he's a major Trump ally in the US Congress.
Who's this? Is the guy who wants to sit on a throne of Chinese skulls or something? Is that
Well,
guy?
no, I mean, that was this guy who was brought on. That was a different guy who was brought in,
Okay.
Tucker Carlson. I mean, let's not forget, Tucker Carlson, back when he supported the Iraq war, before he tried to portray himself as being against the Iraq war, he called Iraqis monkeys.
Right.
Like, this guy, anyway. But the point is that there's this right-wing Trumpist Republican in the US named Matt Gaetz, who's also being investigated because he allegedly sexually trafficked a 17-year-old girl. But that's Florida, man. He's from Florida. He represents the Florida Panhandle, and like the all the Trumpist suburbs of like the beautiful boaters that Trump talked about.
Right.
But anyway, like the petty bourgeoisie, right? Who are the people at the convoy?
Yeah.
To the extent there are truckers, there aren't that many. To the extent they are, they're the petty bourgeois owner operators who are the class basis for fascism. Just like, what percentage of Indian Americans in the US support BJP? A huge, and in Canada, a huge percentage, because they're the petty bourgeois lawyers and doctors. Like,
who can get out of India? There's there's a billion people in India. Who can get out? Like, what percentage of people can get a visa, can get that level of, credential to get to Canada or the US? That's not the median person from India.
And they represent the class basis for fascism is actually not working class. It's petty bourgeois.
Yeah.
It's a counter-revolutionary revolution by the petty bourgeois against the like big bourgeoisie, right? Or you could say the small bourgeoisie, the national bourgeoisie, against the international bourgeoisie, like the Jeff Bezoses. And this also brings in the element of like the vaccination. Like, look, the international bourgeoisie, they're evil, but that's because they're acting on their class interests. But like, they're not dumb. They understand that you should vaccinate your workers because they don't want their workers to be hospitalized and to die. Yeah. So what we see is a petty bourgeois, like you could say like upper middle class, or the small bourgeoisie, having like a revolution, a counter-revolutionary revolution against the big bourgeoisie. And so Donald Trump and all these figures, I mean, his base are the small business owners of the US, right? Like, and if you look at the BJP, it's the same thing. Like, the class basis, there's not a lot of working class people in South Asia being like, we love Hindutva, right?
Right.
It is.
Yeah. I mean, you'll find some, just like we say, like, the working class people have a range of political views. Like, they have a range of views. Lots of
there were Latinos who voted for Donald Trump after he called them rapists. Like,
and I believe you're allowed. Like, I'm enough of a Democrat that I believe you're allowed to have reactionary views. Like, it is what it is. I'm not going to say like you're there's something wrong with your brain because you're a conservative and you're a working class. Like that happens. It happens. But like what's going on? What's really going on with the truckers or with the convoy? Like I don't even want to, yeah, we shouldn't call them truckers. It's not fair. Most of the convoy people are not truckers, and most truckers are not interested in the convoy.
In fact, we've seen that Teamsters, which again represents many truckers unionized in Canada and also the US, they came out firmly against it. And they also pointed out that if you look at the cross-border, until they did the blockade, because at first it was just, they were just doing a protest and occupying Ottawa. But then when they started doing the blockade, that's when things changed. But before that, cross-border trade was basically unaffected by the occupation of Ottawa, because the vast majority of working class truckers, they're still working.
Yeah, they're still working.
Can't afford to just go and sit in an occupation, right? Like,
which
and I understand that this is a critique
money
made of Occupy Wall Street, right? Like,
no, but but Occupy Wall Street was different because there's I believe there's big money behind this convoy. I believe
there's no question
are being paid by the day to be there. Like I believe there's some like the equivalent of strike pay. Like there are people who are getting paid to just be there, and I think that's what the fundraising was for. And they've got a war chest that's pretty big now. So and that's what's enabling them to do all these things, right?
And this is the point I'm getting at. It's like this whole idea to rebrand a so-called populist right. No, I mean, it's a fascistic right. And you see it with BJP in India trying to portray itself as against the INC elites, right? Like the Congress are the real elites, and we represent the working man or whatever, trying to go against the elites. And we represent the majority who are Hindus and they're religious and they're conservative and they want a Hindu Rashtra, right? Yeah. It's so similar to the exact.
And what's amazing is like their economic record is completely irrelevant because they've been de-developing India for the whole time they've been in power this round.
Like, well, look at Trump's record. Trump talked about the he talked about like the left behind. He talked about like a graveyard of factories that were abandoned in like the Rust Belt and all this. And then what do? He had the largest upward transfer of wealth from working people to rich people with his tax break, which was a massive wealth transfer to rich people. And he canceled TPP, okay, but like that didn't really change anything else. Like his economic program was entirely neoliberal. So this whole populist right is fake. But but that's also true, by the way, for classical fascism. The Nazis.
So the historical thing you're talking about, I've been looking into this recently, and my sense is that it wasn't the fascists that destroyed the communists in Germany, which is the example people always give. It was the social democrats. Yeah. So fascism came afterwards. And I increasingly think fascism was basically sponsored and used as a tool, not against German communists, but against the Soviet Union. So it was, the project was, let's get a war going between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union to bring the Soviet Union down. And
which is why the BJP will never, ever, ever, ever pursue an alliance with China, because they need the big boogeyman. Like Nazi Germany needed the Soviet Union, Modi, and also the people to the right of Modi, because like Modi is now increasingly, like Netanyahu in Israel, is starting to be seen as too soft. And you have like Yogi Adityanath and these insane fascists who like want to ethnically cleanse Muslims. Like they need China, because not only because China is allied with Pakistan, but they need China as the big communist boogeyman against because the only way they can continue to have working people to continue to support their neoliberal program is by unifying them with culture politics, the culture war, which is what this like new so-called populist right in the US does, with like focusing on vaccination instead of how many workers have died of COVID. Like instead of focusing, by the way, truckers are extremely exploited. Like talk about a job that is difficult labor.
The real time, like the tracking, the GPS stuff, the monitoring how fast they drive, how
little they can take rest, how little they can sleep. And meanwhile, have we heard anything from this so-called trucker convoy led by non-truckers, opposed by truckers unions? Have they said anything about the actual rights and the conditions of truckers?
No.
Have they called for giving better work conditions and wages and benefits to truckers? No.
No. And then, so quickly, let's do Brazil, because there was an amazing, I didn't know this angle at all. There was a big trucker protest in Brazil just a couple of months ago.
Yeah, they're actually, let me say back. There have been 3 trucker protests, 2 of which were explicitly organized by Bolsonaro supporters.
And so, there's one other dynamic that I didn't mention to you, but like there's a huge element of police support for the convoy. And that's the reason they're still in Ottawa today, is because the police actually love them. And
there's video of them hugging the convoy supporters.
like a receiving line at a wedding is what I said. There's like, they line up to shake hands and they hug everybody. That was at the border with the US.
Who's that reporter? He's really good. I think David Pugliese. In terms of like a mainstream Canadian reporter, he's one of the better ones. Like he's reported on like Canadian support for Ukrainian Nazis. And he posted this tweet, this photo of the people at the convoy, again, the non-trucker led convoy, of these guys in a hot tub, and there's a cop standing right next to him talking to him.
What's next? Are you gonna give him a massage? Are you gonna put some hot oil into the hot tub for the guy? Yeah, no, I saw that. Yeah. No, I mean, the police collusion, I mean, that's what makes this much more, like, it would be funny otherwise, right? Like you could make like dismissive comments about a bunch of clowns. They haven't run anybody over yet. That's one thing I fear. They have considerable amounts of weapons that have been found at some of these blockades. But like the fact that the police are so supportive of them is what makes this, scary and potentially, headed for like a coup like situation. It doesn't matter that Trudeau is not good, right? Like it doesn't matter, that has nothing to do with it. They don't care that he's not a communist. They call him a communist.
They think he's a communist.
They think he's a communist. Yeah.
I mean, it's so similar. It reminds me of the 2014 Maidan coup in Ukraine, right? We're talking about Ukraine. Like, I mean, obviously, Yanukovych is not some great leftist hero, right? He was genuinely very corrupt, but he was also democratically elected. And the reality is that the people replacing him were way worse. And obviously, none of us supports Trudeau at all. The Communist Party of Canada hates Trudeau, but they also recognize what's going on. They're against the convoy because if there is some kind of coup situation, like this is, it's so similar to what the US has done in Syria and Libya and Hong Kong, with the same kind of using like these right-wing elements with foreign funding and astroturfing protests that portray themselves as grassroots. And if they replace Trudeau, who's awful, they'll replace him with something way worse. Like,
so I mean, they're huge. Exactly. There's only so many moves, right? The playbook is actually surprisingly limited in terms of the way things go. And watching that's what's so disappointing to me is like how you can watch this all roll out and still think that the convoy is righteous.
Well, Justin, you know what made me start understanding this better is when you look at the specific people, especially on the US so-called left, and a lot of them won't even necessarily even consider themselves on the left anymore, frankly. Yeah. But the people, they're like kind of more like libertarian people. Yeah. And the people who are now supporting this are the same people who supported Tulsi Gabbard, right?
Right.
And she's a good example of this.
Yeah.
Tulsi Gabbard, like, I mean, to be fair, like
all the way, right?
On Syria, she actually took some brave views. But she ended up being a complete reactionary, and she gets a lot of money. At least she used to when she was in Congress. She got a lot of money from BJP supporters.
Yeah, that's her politics, right? Is BJP. Yeah.
And like if you understand, like the same people, I remember there are people who are now supporting this convoy who claim to be kind of on the left, who are not only defending Tulsi Gabbard, bending over back to justify defending her, but they were even trying to defend Modi and saying that like Modi is like rebelling against the establishment. They love this word establishment because
it's a meaningless word, right?
Because I always say like, no, the establishment means nothing. The problem is the capitalist class. Like,
well, like, are the police not part of the establishment? Like every police agency is like hugging and kissing these people on camera. Like that's not the establishment.
Exactly. Yeah. So it's part of this rebranding that I'm talking about, where fascism or these fascistic kind of far right movements, what differentiates them from like what they would call like the cucks, right? Or like the rhinos, Republican in name only, is that the RINOs, Republican in name only. they like these new, like I mentioned Matt Gaetz. Like Matt Gaetz is like this new generation of younger Republicans who is allegedly a pedophile, and who, by the way, a lot of libertarians are like, reduce the get rid of age of consent laws. But anyway, aside from that, but like they have this kind of like libertarian far right politics, which is like a combination of like libertarian kind of cultural views while also at the same time being like very authoritarian. And Matt Gaetz is like, he supports like drug decriminalization, and he has some of these libertarian views, but he's also like a hardcore authoritarian like Trump. And he gave this speech on the floor of the U.S. Congress a few weeks ago after Argentina's president, the Argentine president Alberto Fernandez, went to Russia and China. And Matt Gaetz said that this is a threat, that Argentina is a threat to U.S. national security, because the Argentine government joined the Belt and Road Initiative. So he said it's now that China has a puppet on close to our borders. And he said that
close to our borders.
And he cited the Monroe Doctrine. He said this is a direct challenge to the Monroe Doctrine, which, by the way, it is, which is good. And then he said that this is their talking point. Russia is a declining power. Russia's not a threat. China is a rising power. China's a threat. So this is the whole thing they do, is they try to portray themselves as anti-war. Tucker Carlson and Matt Gaetz are anti-war because they don't want a war with Russia, but actually they're not anti-war. They want a war with China. Yeah. And it's like the people who say, oh, well, they're working class because they're supporting the trucker convoy, which is not even working class. It's part of this sleight of hand politically that they're doing to try to create this narrative of a working class anti so-called establishment right, which actually is it's just the far right, but they're trying to rebrand it as populist, right?
Yeah. Which is always, I mean, it's always been part of the toolkit, but it just makes me sad to see, people falling for it. And I guess there'll be a lot more of that.
Look at like Pat Buchanan. Do you know him?
Oh yeah. Yeah, Pat Buchanan has a whole history. I don't know if you know this, but he has a book where he's basically saying, like, my friend Dan told me about it, but he's basically saying, like, we screwed up when we fought the Nazis. Yep. Because if we hadn't had that split between Anglo-America and Germany, we could have continued to rule the world forever. And that split is what screwed us up. Like, that's white.
Allying with communism against fascism was our mistake.
Yeah. Exactly.
So, and Pat Buchanan's whole thing is it's paleo-conservatism. That's what he calls it, right? Right. And this guy was a speech writer for Reagan, but I mean, Reagan didn't necessarily have the same policies, but Tucker Carlson is a paleocon. Like they talk about we should have a republic, not an empire, but it's also like full on
Andrew Jackson, like a white republic, like a republic that's democratic,
white nationalism, patriarchy at home, the men control their households, family values. But it's also like basically what they're saying, wink, wink, nudge, nudge, without coming out and saying it openly, is the reason we have all of these wars is because of the globalists, i.e. the Jews, right?
The Jews,
but like
an anti-Semitic thing.
I mean,
which China fits right into that.
Yeah.
Fits right into that mold, right? Because
it's the Chinese infiltrators. And like, obviously anti-Semitism is not just about Jews specifically. In the case of the BJP, it's all about the Muslims, right? Like the fifth column who undermines our nation, right? Yeah. And that's exactly this whole Tucker Carlson thing, is like the internal fifth columns are undermining our nation. And these wars are being waged for the neocons. They're now like criticizing neocons. Right. Like Tucker Carlson, every single time he has a show, he'll criticize the neocons because he's like, the neocons are against our interests. But like, all they're doing is it's just anti-Semitism, but instead of Jews, they just replace it with like the globalists, right?
Right. And neocons, I guess, are people who were once leftists, some kind of Trotskyism some of them, or something, and then
what they're distinguishing is like the old school, like John McCain conservatives and the new Trumper conservatives, right?
Like Wolfowitz, right? Like there's that layer of, I guess they're called neocons.
Like Bush there were multiple like Trots.
Yeah.
And so Horowitz was like he claimed to be around the Panthers. He was kind of Maoish, and then he was like, although.
And they have that whole analysis of like totalitarianism. So it's like Nazis and communists are two sides of the same coin. And so,
and a lot of them were I mean, there were some Maoists because the Maoists took the position of against Soviet, what they called social imperialism. They allied with U.S. imperialism. And then some Trots were also ended up becoming neocons because they took this position of Shachtman, that the Soviet Union was a big threat. And like even Trotsky still defended the Soviet Union as a degenerated worker state. But they said that the Soviet Union was one of the biggest threats to the workers' movement and all this shit. And then we had to ally with imperialism. And anyway, but Carl Gershman.
Tucker doesn't know any of that, does he? Or maybe he does.
No, I mean, he might, but no, but I said he's a paleocon.
Right.
Like, so they're trying to distinguish the neocons from the paleocons, right?
Yeah.
Which there actually are differences. They're not the same. The main difference is the neocons want war in Russia. The paleocons and the so-called populist right, like Tucker and Trump, they want war in China.
And Bannon. So like, so those are Bannon and Trump and Carlson.
Bannon gave this speech literally to Opus Dei. It's not a joke. Literally to Opus Dei. By the way, another way to think about it is the Protestant right versus the Catholic right.
Oh, okay.
Steve Bannon is a Catholic, and there's been, you might have noticed that in Canada too, a lot of these like right-wing media figures have all converted to Catholicism.
Yes,
but they hate the Pope. They think the current Pope is like the anti-Pope, like the anti-Christ Pope, and they want to bring back like the old school, like super right-wing conservative Pope, like John Paul II.
Right.
So there's been like this like turn toward like the conservative right, like Catholic mass, like they call it neo-reactionary right. That's what they call it. Yeah. Like Neo-X is their symbol or whatever.
And then they try to unite, and then they try to have these movements, including the convoy, which tries to unite the right, right?
Exactly.
So they want to unite the right, the big rally that you guys had in
Unite
North
the Right,
Carolina.
it was called, in Charlottesville, Virginia.
Rally. So yeah, I mean, it's
one second. What I also want to say is that
train of thought.
So Steve Bannon gave this speech for this Opus Dei front group.
Yeah,
you can find it on YouTube. And in this speech, he said that this was before Trump was elected, by the way. I think this was 2015 or 2016. And he said, look, we are in a civilizational crisis.
Oh, it was a civilization
And he said,
crisis.
It is Judeo-Christian civilization against China, basically, is what he said. Against godless communist China.
So he's brought back Huntington.
But what he also said is that he said, I'm also against parts of the right that have lost God, like Ayn Rand.
Right.
He's like, they're godless, like the right wing, the free market before all. He's like, no, it's not free market for all. Right. It's our nation before all.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, he says that, but like you look at like Sam Harris, who's an atheist, and then Jordan Peterson, who's like all about the Bible.
And they have like the same politics,
but they all get along. Yeah, like they all get along on the Joe Rogan's show or wherever it is that they meet, right?
Well, the point I'm getting at here is that like there are actual, like on the left, we know there's all these splits.
Yeah.
But there actually are real ideological splits on the right. Yeah. And the Republican Party used to be able to kind of manage those ideological splits with different wings of the party.
Yeah.
But it's become like kind of taken over by these like Trumpist Republicans because they have more of a mass base. Right. Because it's the petty bourgeois, small business owners. Trump called them the beautiful boaters, like all of their boats, and they go out like. That's like
this does bring it back to the convoy, because that is a very similar dynamic in Canada.
It's the class basis for this kind of far right movement in Canada, in the U.S., in India, and around the world. And there are what it is it's the national bourgeoisie. Yeah. Because the last thing, I know I keep cutting you off, but
no, it's okay.
Like. Like Mao had this analysis, which I think is right. If you're in a formerly colonized or partially colonized country, as he said for China, that was his analysis, partially feudal, partially colonized, partially capitalist. Mm-hmm. In that context, in the global South, sometimes it makes sense to form an alliance with the national bourgeoisie against imperialism. But there's also the scenario of the national bourgeoisie becoming fascist and far right and rebelling against the international bourgeoisie. Yeah. And that's what we see to an extent in India. That's what we see in the US with the small business owners. And that's what we see in Canada. So like the national bourgeoisie, there's a serious moment of crisis within capitalism, especially within Western capitals. And we see this division between the international bourgeoisie, who honestly, they don't even really care about the domestic population. They can live in like their gated communities and everything can go to hell.
They're all flying into space.
Yeah.
Checking out space as a possibility.
And like the national bourgeoisie, I mean, they also live in their gated communities in Florida, but like they have fundamental differences. And Trump's base represented like the kind of petty bourgeois small business owners, whereas the Democrats have become the party of the international capitalists, right?
Yeah.
And like that's become in a lot of countries. And Brexit was the perfect example of this, right?
Yeah.
Brexit was led by like the right, not the left. There was a left-wing argument for Brexit, but it was led by like the British petty bourgeoisie and all the people in the city of London, like who represent like the international capitalists who support labor, were against Brexit. And we see the same conflict around the world as there's this moment of capitalist crisis. So instead of the crisis being between the capitalist class and the left has been so defeated in so many countries. It's between different factions of the bourgeoisie. And one faction of the bourgeoisie, the liberal faction, wants to stay with the neoliberal order, which everyone knows is dead. And then there's this new kind of like far right fascistic element that wants to, I mean, they're kind of against neoliberalism, but they also are still they're still capitalists.
Yeah, they are. And they're having, all of these are having trouble holding their coalitions together. And in a sense, that's why the convoy has taken the shape that it has. It's like the conservative parties, the People's Party, they're various because conservatives have also split in Canada. And those parties are having trouble uniting the right for an electoral challenge.
My understanding is that basically this convoy is it's all a big campaign ad for the People's Party and Maxime Bernier, right?
Yeah, that's right. And Pierre Poilievre, and exactly. And
just as in Brazil, in Brazil in 2018, there was this protest with these truckers that the unions opposed and all this, and then it became a massive campaign ad for Bolsonaro. And the only reason he won is, of course, Lula was in prison. But like, I mean, after Lula was in prison and they had this protest and everything, it got Bolsonaro elected. So I wouldn't be surprised to see the People's Party of Canada ride this wave to power.
Yeah, or the conservatives could use it too, because conservatives have presented them with a dilemma because they don't know how much. So the kind of middle of the road conservative, Aaron O'Toole, he supported it a little bit, but not strongly enough. And the Conservative Party threw him out, and they have an interim leader now. So it's having all kinds of effects on right-wing politics in Canada. Wow, Ben, thank you so much. This was very interesting and very multipolar. I'd say we were pretty multipolar.
Yeah, it was good. I mean, it's good the thing is, you know, like I said, there are left-wing supporters of multipolarity. There's also these dumb right-wingers who are complete morons, but what they lack is a class analysis. We need to have a class analysis in addition to the analysis of like, so the thing about geopolitics, right?
Yes.
This is the note to end on. I think geopolitics, a lot of the left is weak on geopolitics, right? Yeah. But a lot of the problem with geopolitics is a lot of the people who talk about geopolitics have like weird, like libertarian politics, right?
Might is right. They basically, you come to this conclusion that basically if you can pull it off, then it was the right thing to do. It's like Bismarck or
and it's like this very weird, like technocratic kind of libertarian. What the left needs is they need to combine this is what I'm trying to do, combine class analysis and Marxism with geopolitics, because usually when we talk about like imperialism, but it's not in like the way that like Brzezinski talks about geopolitics, right? Like we need to actually like understand like exports and imports. We need to talk about like actual
Michael Hudson.
Michael Hudson's the best example of this too.
Radhika Desai in Canada is pretty good.
I know she's also been very influential. She's a great example. Like, and it's not just me. Like, there's a group of us, I think, who are kind of doing a very similar thing. I love Radhika. I love Michael Hudson. Carlos Martinez is great. Denny Haifong, like them are on that group, Friends of Socialist China.
Yeah,
I think like there's like a group of us where we're like trying to like bring like a class element into this geopolitical analysis that is really lacking in a lot of places.
Let's do it. Thank you again, Ben Norton.
Thank you. It was fun. Great show.